We are giving the beach house to your brother.
Thanks, Mom.
But you promised it was mine.
But you promised it was decision is Sarah.
I found out my parents had quietly transferred ownership of my grandmother's $2 million beach house, the same house she'd specifically named me to inherit in her will, into my brother's name through a brief, almost offhand comment my mother made during a phone call about an entirely unrelated matter, mentioning casually that Tanner had finally finished moving into the beach place, as though this represented the most natural, unremarkable development in the world. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something cold and sharp settle into my chest as I processed exactly what she just revealed, understanding immediately that my parents had apparently decided, entirely without my knowledge or consent, that a property my own grandmother had specifically, deliberately willed to me belonged, in their own private calculation, considerably more appropriately to my brother instead. Stick with me, because what I discovered over the following weeks about exactly how my parents had orchestrated that transfer, and what I ultimately did once I understood the full scope of their calculated betrayal, would completely dismantle the comfortable, quietly funded lifestyle they'd spent years assuming was simply theirs by right. My name is Coralie Winthrop. I'm 34 years old, and my grandmother, Eleanor Fitch, passed away 3 years ago, leaving behind a modest estate that included, most significantly, a beautiful $2 million beach house along the North Carolina coast that she'd purchased decades earlier and had specifically, explicitly named me as sole beneficiary of within her formal, legally executed will, a decision she'd explained to me directly during her final months, telling me clearly that she wanted the property to remain in careful, deliberate hands given how much genuine meaning that specific house held throughout her own long-cherished life. My parents, Harlan and Beatrice Winthrop, had served as co-executors of my grandmother's estate following her passing, a role that provided them considerable practical access to and influence over the formal property transfer process, access I genuinely trusted them to handle faithfully according to my grandmother's clearly documented wishes, given the close, loving relationship I'd always believed I maintained with both my parents throughout my entire life. That devastating phone call revealed, instead, that my parents had apparently used their position as estate executors to quietly, deliberately redirect the beach house's formal ownership toward my younger brother Tanner, 29, rather than completing the straightforward, legally required transfer to me that my grandmother's will had explicitly, unambiguously specified, a betrayal I would spend the following weeks carefully uncovering the full, calculated scope of. My grandmother, Eleanor Fitch, had always maintained a particularly close, meaningful relationship with me throughout my entire childhood and continuing well into my adult years, a closeness that developed partly through shared temperament, both of us naturally more introspective and detail-oriented than the rest of our extended family, and partly through countless summers I'd spent at that specific beach house throughout my formative years, learning to sail, collecting shells along the shoreline, listening to her stories about building a genuinely meaningful independent life following her own difficult divorce decades earlier. Tanner, by contrast, had always maintained a considerably more distant, less personally invested relationship with our grandmother throughout those same years, visiting the beach house only occasionally, generally expressing more enthusiasm for our parents' own vacation properties and social activities than for the quieter, more contemplative atmosphere our grandmother's coastal home genuinely represented throughout her own life and continuing legacy. I remember specific conversations with my grandmother during her final months, conversations where she explained directly and clearly her reasoning behind leaving the beach house specifically to me rather than dividing it between Tanner and me, or leaving it to our parents to eventually distribute as they saw fit. This house needs someone who genuinely understands what it represents, she told me during one particularly meaningful visit, roughly 2 months before her passing. Not just as a valuable property, but as a place built around quiet reflection and genuine independence. I've watched you develop those same values throughout your entire life, Coralie, and I want this house to remain with someone who will honor what it actually means, not just its market value. She'd formalized this decision through a properly executed will, working directly with an experienced estate attorney specifically to ensure her wishes would be legally clear and difficult to challenge or reinterpret following her passing, precautions that, I would eventually recognize with painful clarity, revealed she'd perhaps anticipated, even during those final months, some possibility that her explicit wishes might face challenge or manipulation once she was no longer present to advocate for them directly herself. To understand how my parents ultimately justified their calculated manipulation of my grandmother's clearly documented wishes, you have to understand a broader pattern of financial dependence that had developed gradually throughout recent years, one where I had, without ever fully recognizing its true extent, become considerably more central to my parents' comfortable retirement lifestyle than either they or I had ever directly acknowledged. I'd built a genuinely successful career over the preceding decade as a corporate attorney specializing in commercial real estate transactions, achieving considerable professional success that had allowed me to provide meaningful financial support to my parents throughout their retirement years, support that had gradually expanded from occasional generous gifts into something considerably more substantial and structural. I'd quietly paid off the remaining balance on their own retirement homes. Mortgage roughly 4 years earlier, funded several significant medical expenses my father's declining health had generated, and had established more recently a monthly financial contribution specifically intended to help supplement their retirement income given some genuinely disappointing investment losses they'd experienced during an earlier market downturn. Tanner, by contrast, had built a considerably less financially stable career throughout those same years, moving between several different sales positions without ever fully establishing the kind of consistent professional success or financial independence I'd managed to achieve, a pattern our parents had consistently attributed to Tanner simply finding his path, rather than any genuine concern regarding his own financial planning or professional development. I recognize now, with considerable painful hindsight, that my parents had likely developed a specific calculation regarding the beach house transfer that reflected this broader financial dynamic. Understanding that I possessed sufficient financial stability and success to genuinely not require the beach house's considerable value for my own security, while Tanner, given his own considerably more precarious financial situation, might benefit more immediately and significantly from inheriting such a substantial valuable asset, a calculation that entirely disregarded my grandmother's own explicit, carefully considered wishes in favor of what my parents apparently believed represented more practical, immediate family need. That devastating phone call occurred on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening, my mother calling to discuss unrelated plans for an upcoming family gathering, mentioning, almost as an afterthought amid otherwise mundane conversation, that Tanner had finally finished moving into the beach place and seemed to be settling in really well there. I remember the specific, disorienting confusion I experienced processing that comment, initially assuming some misunderstanding or miscommunication given my clear understanding that the beach house belonged to me according to my grandmother's explicit will. "Wait, what do you mean Tanner moved into the beach house?" I asked, my voice carrying confusion rather than yet the devastating recognition that would soon follow. My mother's response, delivered with a casualness that genuinely stunned me once I fully processed its implications, revealed the calculated nature of what my parents had apparently done. "Oh, we transferred the deed to him a few months back," she explained, as though describing the most ordinary, unremarkable administrative decision. "We figured, given everything, it made more practical sense for Tanner to have it rather than letting it sit mostly empty while you're busy with your career in the city. You barely have time to visit anyway, sweetheart." I sat there, genuinely stunned into temporary silence, processing both the specific, calculated betrayal itself and the casual, dismissive manner in which my mother described a decision that directly, deliberately contradicted my own grandmother's explicit final wishes. "Mom," I said finally, my voice carrying a controlled intensity one could feel building throughout my entire body. "That house was specifically willed to me. Grandma was extremely clear about that. How did you even transfer the deed without my knowledge or signature?" The silence that followed my question carried a quality that confirmed, unmistakably, my mother's genuine awareness that this transfer had occurred through means she now recognized, even in that moment, as considerably more legally and morally questionable than her earlier, casual explanation had initially suggested. I contacted an attorney, Gideon Ashcombe, who specialized specifically in estate disputes and probate litigation, walking him carefully through the entire situation and requesting his help understanding exactly how my parents had managed to transfer a property my grandmother's will had explicitly designated for me into my brother's name instead. Gideon's careful investigation over the following weeks revealed a genuinely troubling pattern of manipulation my parents had apparently employed throughout the estate settlement process. As co-executors, they'd apparently filed formal documentation with the probate court claiming I had verbally indicated, during a period roughly 6 months after my grandmother's passing, that I wished to disclaim my inheritance interest in the beach house specifically, a claim that was entirely, completely false, one I had never once made or even remotely suggested throughout any conversation with either parent. This kind of disclaimer requires your own formal, notarized signature under normal circumstances, Gideon explained during one particularly difficult meeting, reviewing the probate documentation his investigation had uncovered. But because your parents served as co-executors, and because you weren't actively monitoring the estate settlement process closely given your trust in their handling of your grandmother's wishes, they were apparently able to submit alternative documentation suggesting verbal disclaimer that the court, unfortunately, accepted without the more rigorous verification that should have genuinely been required for a transfer of this magnitude and significance. I learned, through this careful investigation, that my parents had apparently worked with a family friend who happened to be a notary public, someone who had, whether through genuine confusion or deliberate complicity, notarized documentation suggesting I had personally appeared to formally disclaim my inheritance interest, despite my never once having done so or even being present for whatever meeting this fraudulent documentation apparently claimed had occurred. This discovery, revealing genuine legal fraud rather than simply questionable but technically permissible family decision-making, transformed my entire understanding of the situation, confirming that my parents hadn't simply made a difficult but ultimately defensible practical judgment call regarding the property's most appropriate recipient, but had instead engaged in deliberate, calculated legal fraud specifically to circumvent my grandmother's explicit wishes and secure the property for Tanner instead. I confronted my parents directly once Gideon's investigation had revealed the full scope of their fraudulent documentation, requesting a formal meeting at their home specifically to address what I now understood represented genuine legal fraud, rather than simply a painful family disagreement regarding inheritance distribution. You forged documentation claiming I disclaimed my inheritance, I told them, my voice carrying a controlled fury I'd spent considerable time preparing throughout the preceding difficult weeks. That's not a family decision you're entitled to make on my behalf. That's fraud, and I have documentation proving exactly how you orchestrated it. My father, notably quieter throughout most of our family's interactions over the years, spoke first, his voice carrying a defensive quality that revealed genuine discomfort rather than any authentic remorse. We thought it made sense, Coralie. You're successful, you don't need that house the way Tanner does. We figured you'd understand eventually that this was really about what's practically best for the whole family. That's not your decision to make, I said, my voice rising despite my earlier intention to maintain careful composure throughout this difficult confrontation. Grandma made that decision herself deliberately, and she explained her reasoning to me directly. You didn't just override her wishes, you committed actual legal fraud to circumvent them entirely. My mother attempted a different approach throughout that difficult conversation, appealing directly to family loyalty and harmony, rather than genuinely engaging with the specific legal and ethical severity of what they'd actually done. We're still your parents, Coralie. Surely you're not going to let a house tear this family apart. Think about what pursuing this legally would actually do to our relationship, to the whole family's stability. I recognized, throughout that entire difficult conversation, that my parents genuinely expected their appeal to family harmony and loyalty to outweigh any consideration of the actual fraud and betrayal they deliberately orchestrated, an expectation that revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how thoroughly they'd come to view my own financial success and general accommodating nature as resources they felt entitled to exploit whenever doing so served their own preferences or Tanner's perceived needs. I left that difficult confrontation with genuine clarity regarding exactly what I needed to do next, understanding that pursuing formal legal action to reclaim the beach house represented only part of the appropriate response to my parents' calculated fraud, given the broader pattern of financial dependence and entitled expectation their betrayal had ultimately revealed throughout our entire family relationship. I discontinued immediately and completely the various forms of ongoing financial support I'd been quietly providing my parents throughout recent years, canceling the monthly retirement supplement I'd established and informing them directly that I would no longer be covering any additional medical expenses or other financial needs that arose going forward, given their demonstrated willingness to commit genuine fraud against my own interests specifically to benefit my brother instead. I remember the specific phone call where I informed my parents of this decision, my mother's voice shifting rapidly from her earlier appeals to family harmony into something considerably more panicked once she genuinely processed the practical implications of losing financial support they'd apparently, quietly come to depend upon considerably more significantly than either of us had previously directly acknowledged. "You can't just cut us off like this," she said, her voice carrying genuine alarm. "We're barely managing as it is, especially with your father's ongoing medical needs. You should have thought about that before committing fraud to steal my inheritance," I told her, my voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even me given the genuine emotional weight of that specific conversation. "I'm not obligated to keep quietly funding a comfortable lifestyle for parents who just demonstrated exactly how little my own rights and wishes actually matter to you, when they conflict with what you've decided Tanner deserves instead." I proceeded simultaneously with Gideon's formal legal action seeking to void the fraudulent property transfer and restore the beach house to my rightful ownership according to my grandmother's original, legally documented wishes, understanding that this formal legal process would likely require considerable time and continued emotional resilience throughout the following months. The combination of my discontinued financial support and the formal legal proceedings challenging the fraudulent property transfer created immediate, significant practical consequences throughout my parents' previously comfortable retirement lifestyle, consequences that unfolded considerably more rapidly and severely than I believe either of them had genuinely anticipated when they'd originally orchestrated their calculated deception. My parents, without my previously quiet monthly financial support, found themselves genuinely struggling to manage their existing expenses, particularly given my father's ongoing medical needs that had, I learned through occasional updates from extended family members, required considerably more significant costs than their own retirement savings alone could comfortably sustain without my previous supplemental support. Tanner, meanwhile, faced his own mounting difficulties once the formal legal challenge to the fraudulent transfer proceeded through probate court, the property's ownership status remaining genuinely uncertain throughout those months, complications that apparently created significant strain within his own recent decision to relocate his entire life to the beach house, a decision that now, given the ongoing legal uncertainty, appeared considerably less secure and permanent than he'd originally assumed when our parents had first orchestrated the fraudulent transfer specifically to benefit him. I learned, through Gideon's continued investigation and occasional updates from extended family members who remained in closer contact with my parents than I currently maintained, that my parents had begun quietly seeking financial assistance from other extended family members, attempts that met with limited success once those relatives learned, through various channels, about the actual circumstances surrounding both the fraudulent property transfer and my own subsequent decision to discontinue financial support given that specific, calculated betrayal. I didn't personally orchestrate every specific consequence my parents and brother experienced throughout that difficult period. My own actions limited entirely to discontinuing financial support I was never actually obligated to provide in the first place, and pursuing legitimate legal action to reclaim property that rightfully, legally belonged to me according to my grandmother's explicit wishes. But I recognized, processing everything that unfolded throughout those months, a clear, direct connection between my parents' calculated fraud and the genuine, significant consequences that fraud ultimately triggered once I stopped quietly absorbing the practical costs of maintaining their comfortable lifestyle despite their demonstrated willingness to betray my own interests so completely. The formal legal proceedings challenging my parents' fraudulent property transfer ultimately concluded roughly 8 months after that initial devastating phone call, the probate court finding clear, convincing evidence of deliberate fraud in the original disclaimer documentation, voiding the transfer entirely and formally restoring the beach house's ownership to me according to my grandmother's original, legally documented wishes. This legal resolution required Tanner to vacate the beach house entirely, a genuinely difficult transition for him given how thoroughly he'd apparently reorganized his own life around the assumption of permanent, secure ownership throughout those preceding months. I felt, processing this specific outcome, a complicated mixture of genuine satisfaction regarding the legal vindication of my grandmother's actual wishes alongside continued sadness regarding how thoroughly this entire situation had damaged my relationships with both my parents and my brother throughout that difficult year. My parents faced additional legal consequences beyond simply losing the property transfer itself, the probate court's finding of deliberate fraud prompting formal referral to state authorities for consideration of criminal charges related to fraudulent estate documentation. Consequences that, while I hadn't specifically pursued them independently, represented appropriate accountability for genuine legal fraud, rather than simply a difficult family disagreement regarding inheritance distribution. I ultimately reclaimed the beach house entirely, working with a property manager to prepare it for eventual personal use while I continued processing the broader emotional aftermath of everything that had unfolded throughout that difficult year. Understanding that the property itself, however genuinely meaningful given my grandmother's specific intentions, would likely always carry some complicated emotional weight given the calculated fraud my own parents had committed specifically to prevent me from ever receiving it according to her actual wishes. Standing on the beach house's familiar porch roughly a year after that initial devastating phone call, finally able to genuinely enjoy the property my grandmother had so deliberately, lovingly intended for my own benefit, I thought often about everything that had unfolded since that ordinary Tuesday evening when my mother's casual comment first revealed my parents' calculated betrayal. I'd learned, throughout that entire difficult year, something genuinely important about the specific boundaries required to protect both my own interests and my grandmother's actual, documented wishes, understanding that genuine family loyalty, properly considered, requires honest respect for individual autonomy and legitimate legal rights, rather than simply unconditional accommodation of whatever decisions other family members believe serve their own preferences or perceived practical needs. My relationship with my parents remained genuinely, significantly strained throughout that following year, our interactions limited primarily to occasional, formal communication rather than the closer relationship we'd maintained before their calculated fraud fundamentally, permanently altered how I understood both their character and their genuine regard for my own rights and wishes. I maintained even more limited contact with Tanner throughout that same period, understanding that his own willingness to accept property he genuinely knew, at some level, hadn't been legitimately transferred according to our grandmother's actual wishes reflected troubling complicity that would require considerable time, if ever, to genuinely reconcile. Tamsin Cole, my closest friend throughout this entire difficult process, told me once, sitting together on that same beach house porch during a visit roughly 8 months after the legal resolution, that watching me navigate this entire situation had taught her something meaningful about the genuine courage required to enforce reasonable boundaries even against one's own parents. Most people would have just let it go, she said, especially given how much financial support you've been quietly providing them for years. But you didn't, and I think that took real strength. I think often, even now, about my grandmother's specific words during that final meaningful visit before her passing. Her insistence that this particular house required someone who genuinely understood what it represented beyond simple market value. I hadn't fully understood at the time exactly how significant that specific inheritance would eventually become, not simply as valuable coastal property, but as the exact circumstance that would ultimately reveal, with painful but necessary clarity, precisely how conditional my own parents' love and loyalty had actually been throughout years I'd never previously questioned or examined closely enough to fully understand.